Hello, I'm Rob Himmelstein, President of MRJ. I know many people may still be signing on, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time and keep this on schedule. We're very proud to continue our webinar series with a conversation with Dr. Andrew Rehfeld. Dr. Rehfeld is a leading political scientist and distinguished Jewish communal leader. He is currently the president of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. The rest of his bio you can read where you registered. Steve Sherman is working the magic behind the scenes, and our interviewer today is Steve Portnoy, MRJ's immediate past president, and currently MRJ's executive director. HUC has been in the news a lot lately, making this particularly timely. So without further delay, I'll pass it on to Mr. Portnoy to start the discussion. Steve?
Thank you, Rob, and I want to particularly say thank you to Dr. Rehfeld. This is a virtual meeting of one that has been oft delayed due to pandemic situations, but we're glad to finally be together, at least virtually in this instance. And I just want to mention that if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A, and that this webinar is being recorded. That being said, I want to turn over the virtual meeting to Dr. Rehfeld.
Steven, thank you so much, and thank all of you who have taken your time out, for those of you who are here this evening, to be here with us tonight. I'm joined tonight by two of my colleagues, Jessica Silver, who is our Chief of Staff and Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, who's just turned her camera on to say hi, and another Dr. Rehfeld, who's actually Rabbi Elliot Kleinman, who's looking through his video camera as well. So Elliot, thank you for joining us, and since we're on webinar format, I think the suggestion was we turn off our webcams unless we're speaking. So Elliot, thank you. Friends, I'm going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes as requested by the leadership in the Reform Judaism. I'm going to talk about two specific topics. One is to review the decision that the Board of Governors just made after a 2-year process, and talk a little bit about what informed that decision and what our next steps are going to be. And number two, a little bit about my own views about the direction of Reform Judaism, really looking back over the last 150 years, and so that we can begin to plan ahead for the next 150 years. I'm looking forward to, after that, having Q&A and being able to engage in discussion, as much to learn about what's of importance to you, individuals who have made our movement what it is, strengthening it by bringing people of shared affinities together in order to commit to strengthening our community, building our values, and ensuring that our Jewish community, and our Reformed Jewish community in particular, remains strong and vibrant. So with that, let me get started. I want to begin with a presentation. I'm going to share us some slides for this first part. Can you see it says Men of Reformed Judaism? Are you seeing that, Stephen? Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing. We've been working on a strategic planning process for about 2 years, and after the first year, we had arrived at a certain number of goals after having over 350 interviews with stakeholders, alumni, students, faculty, and boards of governors or donors to figure out what was important and where we were heading. And we alighted on 5 key goals. Well, you see 4+, and I'll explain that in just a moment. The first 4, educational excellence, remembering that we are at heart an academic institution whose faculty and scholarship drive ideas that shape the movement and that build leaders for our future. Number 2 is to recognize that students coming in today to HUC are not the kinds of students that were here 10 or 20 or 40 years ago. That students are expecting a different level of service, of care, of support, and that we need to meet their needs in order to strengthen them for future service to our people and our communities. So student support was our second major goal. Number 3, a commitment to growing our impact, understanding that we have an impact not only in producing the very best leadership for our communities through our 6 graduate programs, but also through the reach of our community programs and our continuing education. Programs like HUC Connect, now finishing its second season of engaging programs online to continue education and support of learning and ideas throughout our communities. And number 4, recognizing how tremendously our world has changed over the last 20 or 30 years and how we need to do things differently and get to a position of financial sustainability. Just to give you one figure, in 2006, URJ congregations supported not only the URJ, but HUC, with dues that amounted that produced proceeds to HUC over $12 million a year to sustain our work. Just before COVID in 2019, the last year before COVID hit, that number went from 12 to $8 million, not in one year, but over that time period. And in 1 year, from 2019 to 2020, we went from $8 million to $5.5 million. We're now anticipating next year we will receive $5 million. When you have such significant decline that's reflective of certain changes within Reform Judaism, our need to commit to financial sustainability becomes that much stronger. And then finally, after the historic reconciliation reports that the investigation that we initiated and that we publicized in 2021, we added the 5th goal of ensuring a sacred and respectful culture with expectations about behavior and conduct from everyone with whom we're engaged: our students, our faculty, our staff, our alumni, our governors. And that in some ways has to shape it all. These 5 goals formed a vision that we adopted to drive our work. And the vision is graphically illustrated this way. At the very bottom is the foundation, a foundation that understands that Hebrew Union College is one global institution. We might have 1 location, we might have 17 locations, we now have 4 locations, but we operate as a single global, impactful institution, and we're just going to do more if we can try to leverage our strength across the system. Number 2 is to understand that the work that we do, as diverse and as multiplied and multiplexed as it is nevertheless can be understood in 4 key areas. Number 1, as a seminary of Reform and Progressive Judaism, the seminary that produces the very best rabbis, cantors for our congregations. Number 2, that we operate what are a set of Jewish and professional studies that shape undergraduate and graduate student life. Schools like the Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, raising up Jewish nonprofit leaders for our congregations and our nonprofit organizations based on Jewish values. Our education school, our Pines Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and of course our undergraduate program, the Lockheim School, which is the undergraduate school of the University of Southern California. In addition to a seminary and a division of Jewish and professional studies, we also have extraordinary research collections and academic resources, most of which, the vast majority of which, are housed on our Cincinnati campus. This includes the American Jewish Archives, as well as the Clow Library, one of the most important collections of printed materials in the Jewish world. And that number 4, the work we are doing in Israel is transforming not just Israeli society, but really stands to be a foundation for global progressive Jewish education around the world. We've had calls from communities in South Africa, from Paris, and other places in Europe, in the former Soviet Union, in South America, seeking our support for raising up rabbis and cantors in their communities. And so each of these 4 areas will be the area of future focus as we move forward in rethinking Hebrew Union College to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And to do all of that bathed in an overarching culture at the very top of this slide of sacred, respectful communities of academic inquiry and spiritual exploration. Now, I said just a moment ago that we were doing this in order to build capacity to meet the challenges of the 21st century. What are some of those challenges? Well, I suspect you could tell me more than I could even tell you, because you've been living them and feeling them, and I'm eager to learn later as we talk what you see the challenges being in the future. but for us, a couple key ones to think about. Number one, an increasingly secular population, a population that is not seeking traditional religious engagement. Number two, a population that is not seeking membership and seeking, in fact, not to be limited by denominational boundaries. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of my time tonight. And number three, in communities that are no longer going through the traditional feeders or pipelines into the system that used to be so taken for granted. I like to give the story that I was, when I was a teenager, I was in confirmation class at Baltimore Hebrew congregation. And in a picture of my confirmation class, there are either 60 or 70 people together. I looked more or less exactly the same as I do now. Yeah, one or two things different. But if you go back to Baltimore Hebrew now with Rabbi Andy Bush, who's the senior rabbi there, a wonderful man, I think he has 15 students in his confirmation class. And by the way, I believe Baltimore Hebrew congregation is still the largest Reformed congregation in Baltimore. So it's just a massive change. And when you go from 60 or 70 to 12 or 15 or 18, you are shrinking the well of students that are following into, that are feeding into the pipeline. So we are facing massive changes, reductions of support from URJ congregations, which are not their choice, but because of their own changes, and needing to shift. And because of that, we've just initiated some changes. I'm going to go back to my slide deck and talk about what those changes are. So the Board of Governors in April 2022, just a few weeks ago, voted to do the following three things. Number one, to restructure our rabbinical school to maintain residential programs in Los Angeles and New York. And that means no longer running a residential program where we were founded in Cincinnati. And I just want to say I know how painful and hard that decision was. We'll talk a little bit about why we made that. Number two, we decided to begin a process to reimagine our historic Cincinnati campus as a center for research and educational engagement. And remember, that idea of that research center was one of our four core pillars. I'm going to put that slide up just now as I'm saying it. The research collections and academic research. This is not a closing of a campus. This is not a backing away from our research collections, but this is a way of rethinking how we strengthen them and support the entire movement and our people by our management of them in a more focused and sustained way. Number two, as I said, the reimagination. And finally, number three. So number one, to do residential programs only on the coasts. Number two, to reimagine the historic Cincinnati campus as a place for research and educational engagement. And number three, to develop a new academically rigorous low residency program for clergy. And I'm super excited about this third piece. And I want to just spend a moment telling you what I think the potential is here, because frankly, I may be talking on this webinar right now to our future students, and I'm not kidding. So one of the things we know about the changing world in the 21st century is that people are starting their lives later, and they're living longer, much longer, significantly longer, healthy and vibrant lives. And because of that, we're looking at populations that, beginning at the age of 35, 40, 45, even 60 or 70, are saying, what now? What can I do with my life to give it meaning and purpose? As we are currently structured, the only way we can train you to be a rabbi or a cantor is if you are willing to move to one of our residential programs, which has a lot going for it. But over the last 2 years, through the magic of Zoom, forced upon all of us, we realized the potential to offer academically rigorous training in rabbinics and cantorial studies is significant, and it's only going to grow more and more possible as we get better and better technology and better growth. And that means instead of serving 3 areas of Jewish North America, we can suddenly partner with our 800 plus URJ congregations and raise up rabbis and cantors in 800 different locations throughout Jewish North America, in the Midwest, in the South, in Florida, in Chicago, in the Pacific Northwest, and let's just name a country we don't even serve today directly, Canada. Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton. All of these places where we have people that would love to learn and study and grow and serve as Jewish leaders of their community, that we will now be able to develop rabbinical and cantorial studies for them. It will require some periods of back-in residence periods, and we are designing them to use the Cincinnati campus to bring people back to the homeland, back to where we got started. So those are the decisions that we made, and we did it because there's so much that has been in free fall for HUC. So I want to show you some of the numbers that inform this to help you appreciate what we were facing. So the demographical reality is declining rabbinical students at HUC and other seminaries, increased competition, and decreasingly religiously identified Jewish population, all the things that we just talked about, weaker movement affiliation. Let me show you some of these numbers. This slide is showing the stateside rabbinical program enrollment over the last 30 years. The red line is the normalized, the flattened trend, and you can see it's a downward spin. Excuse me. It's a straight decline down. Curiously, after 2007, 2006 was the last year that we were able to reliably secure classes of over 39. Since then, we've had trouble getting anything over 30 students incoming. This is just for the rabbinical program. And if you notice, we were able to get it back up to 30 last year. We're now looking at an incoming class that may be as low as 15 students for next year. And we have retirements of baby boom rabbis coming up. We have pulpits that are beginning not to be filled, but we also know that we have declines in congregations and mergers, and they're shrinking, and they may not be able to sustain. We need to do better, and we need to do better by recruiting the very best and the brightest in vibrant programs. When you have so few students entering the school, it impacts their education, and it impacts our ability to raise up the very best for the next generation. And so here's another illustration of that. I'll get to that in a second. Sorry, I wanted to contextualize. Our decline is not just HUC's decline. It is a decline that is across all of the major seminaries. So this slide is showing a comparison of how we're doing compared to 5 of our competitors, our peer institutions. At the bottom, you'll see the color coding. It's Hebrew Union College. It's the Reconstructionists in orange. The gray is JTS, the conservative seminary. The yellow is AJU, another conservative seminary that spun off of JTS and is in the West Coast. And blue is Hebrew College, which is a multi-denominational seminary in Boston that only began ordaining rabbis 20 years ago. If you look back in 2007, the whole field was, and before this even more, was at about 100 rabbis that they were entering in the class. And over this time, it's been a steady decline, steady up and down, but it's the overall trend is down by about 20%. And now we're looking at about a class of 80s. I believe that some of our peers have single digits entering classes. If you'll notice, by comparison, we continue to be the market leader. That is, more students choosing non-Orthodox seminary are studying with HUC than any of our other peers. And what's really interesting, if you look at this about the trends, in 2007, our competitors were the gray and the yellow. That is, the JTS and AJU are conservative seminaries on the right of us religiously. If you fast forward to 2020 and 2021, you'll see that the gray and the yellow have shrunk considerably, and the growth is happening now in the orange, which is the Reconstructionist, and the non-denominational seminary at Hebrew College, or the multi-denominational in blue. So what I would characterize them as religiously to our left. Things are shifting, they're declining across the board, and that's what we're responding to. As I said, as you get smaller and smaller numbers, you're also impacting the quality of the education and our ability to raise up the very best students into the very best rabbis and cantors. So here's the number of our incoming students over the last 15 years. So we had 214 15 years ago. That was already down to 177 total students on campus in 2011 and 12, dropped to 151 just 5 or 6 years ago, and now it's at 134 in last year. And this coming year, it's going to be even lower than that, closer to about 110, if I have the numbers right. What does that look like on our campuses? So in each of our campuses, this is what it looks like. The second-year class, remember the first year is in Israel, and so the second through the fifth year, Cincinnati, this is the total number of students on campus, 20 students on campus anticipated next year. We actually know that number is now going to be 17. LA and New York are both in the 40s, and this is down from their highs in the 50s. Cincinnati 15 years ago, just 15 years ago, had 66 students studying there. But when you have such small groups of students, you can't enjoy the vibrancy of learning, the diversity of opinion, the diversity of students that is going to strengthen our programs. And that's why the urgency we felt to make a change and move to 2. And I recognize we could have done it well in any of the 2 of the 3 campuses. We chose Cincinnati for a set of reasons, primarily driven by student choice and the vibrancy of the resources that we can draw on around us in the community. So moving forward, so this is the challenges of 3 campuses. Consolidation addresses that. We are now focused on a couple of areas. I've already spoken about my excitement about the low residency program, but what does a reimagined Cincinnati campus look like? Well, expanded learning opportunities for our students and others. For example, increased in-person access to the CLOW and the AJA. Currently, as of 2019, the last year that we had non-COVID, so that everything was in person, 16% of all users of the AJA, 16% were affiliated with HUC. I don't mean just on the Cincinnati campus. I mean affiliated in any way with HUC. Another way to put that is that 84% of the use of the AJA was not from HUC students or faculty. That's an enormous area of growth for us to bring LA and New York students and faculty onto campus to use the resources of the AJA and the CLOW and to really build it up as a research center. Number 3, a new way for the Jewish community to gather on our historic campus. So we have some key components that we're imagining and building. In-residence location, I mentioned that already. A summer session, intensive designed to make the most of the history, the academic resources, and cultural richness of the Cincinnati campus. HUC faculty gatherings. Because of the low cost of housing, we can bring faculty back for a week or 3 or 4 days to do studying together. I would love us to build out an alumni homecoming, something that we've never done, and we ought to, with over 4,000 graduates of our programs throughout North America right now. We're looking at a second-year reunion for students to reconnect after their year in Israel, bringing them back to Cincinnati to do this. And 5th year or any year fellowships for research at the CLOW and the AJA to do the work there. So the decision that we made honors our past and makes the most of our present assets and opportunities and moves us towards an inspiring and sustainable future. But I want to say again what I said at the beginning. The decision involved a great deal of pain and a great deal of loss because of what Cincinnati has been and what it still is. And our mission, the responsibility that I have as the president of this institution, is to ensure that we can continue to deliver on that mission and sustain Reform Judaism. So in the last few minutes before I turn this back over to Steven, let me just mention a little bit about that idea of Reform Judaism and what it is heading into. And I had the good fortune of being invited onto Yehuda Kurtzer's podcast a couple of weeks ago to talk about this. And after the meeting, I hope that we could send out a link to you so you can hear more about it. But the really curious thing, and the thing that I think that we often don't recognize, is just how influential Reform Judaism has been since its establishment in North America by Isaac Mayer Wise in the 1800s, in the second half of the 19th century. What Wise was able to do was something that the Germans had not been able to do, which is, of course, where Reform Judaism was founded. And that is establish a set of institutions that would sustain a new kind of Judaism for a new kind of land, America. And that Judaism was based on three key principles. Number one, that reason and rationality would drive our engagement and understanding of the world. Number two, that authority rests within each of us individual, authority for morals and for religious decisions. And that finally, our Judaism is to be used not only for its own sake and valued for its own sake, but also instrumentally for the value and the changes that it can make in the world, bringing it towards justice. Now, those three principles allowed us to say, Sinai, good story, important moment, but ultimately a myth. We don't have evidence that anything actually happened there. And so our job is to figure out how to make meaning out of something like that, bringing a scientific framework into our understanding of Jewish texts and history. Number two, the autonomy of morality and religious life meant that the rabbi would continue to be a sacred teacher and guide, but that ultimately each of us had the responsibility to make decisions about ritual, about morals and ethics. And number three, the idea of the instrumentality of our religion, that no longer could we say the Jewish people was a chosen people and we could be self-satisfied with that idea of the intrinsic value, but we had to say whatever intrinsic value was there that we take meaning and purpose from, we also have to use it instrumentally to improve the world through pursuing justice. Now, those three principles, I would say in the last 150 years, have spread widely. And I would claim, and I do claim in the podcast, and we can maybe continue this conversation, that Reform Judaism today, that kind of Reform Judaism as defined and practiced in the 19th century, is now the American Judaism. It's the kind of Judaism that is by and large practiced in the Reconstructionist movement, in the conservative movement, even in more modern Orthodoxy. Believe me, that's a contentious statement that I don't mean to put ideas in other people's mouths, but in my view as a philosopher, that is what I see. So the question arises, what distinguishes us as a movement? And here I'll just end by saying that I think we have elevated the idea of autonomy and choice in Reform Judaism so strongly and really in a very powerful way that's important, but that sometimes we forget that the choice that we have by taking on the freedom to make a choice doesn't tell us what we should do with the freedom now that we have it and that autonomy. And I think one area that I would like to be focusing on for us as a movement is to say, what are the obligations that we believe we should take on? What are the obligations we should take on to study, for ritual life, for communal engagement, for ethics, and for justice? Those 5 things: study, ritual, community life, ethics, and justice. And that's the kind of conversation that I believe will shape a comprehensive Reform Judaism, focusing not only on keeping the tent flaps open and welcoming people in by the elevation of choice, but also talking more, what are we inviting them in to do? So with that, I'll stop here. We have so much to talk about, including the increasing diversity of our communities that we have to be keeping an eye on, and I look forward to learning with you over the next hour or so. Steven, I'll turn this back to you. You are muted, I'm afraid.
Thank you. So much there to unpack. I'm really not even certain where to begin. So I think you've addressed most of the questions in that we've gotten in our Q&A. I don't know whether you've seen them. So I'm just going to sort of rehash just a little bit. Statistics that demonstrate closing Cincinnati is more efficacious than New York or Los Angeles. The loss of donors, is that offset? Has that been part of the consideration? One anonymous question is under the understanding that no students were recruited for Cincinnati this year for the campus. And I think those sort of touch on some of the issues related to the Cincinnati campus. There are, of course, others which we'll come back to in a moment.
Sure. Thank you, Steven. So look, I know these questions. I'm going to share with you some data about them because there's a lot of misinformation that's being spread. We've increased the number of students that have chosen the Cincinnati campus since I joined this institution just over 3 years ago, and I want to show you those numbers and then explain why we decided that Cincinnati was the right campus to change. I'm going to do this with another slide. So what I'm showing you here is the students' own preferences of where they want to be. And they're not where they landed, but where they chose based on their decisions. So this is over the last roughly 15 years, 13, 14 years. Cincinnati was the first choice of 21% of them. Los Angeles, about 29 or 30%. And New York, by and large, the most popular and interesting, it's 57%. And some folks were talking about cost, and they know that the cost of the coast is much higher than Cincinnati. So if you look in the highlighted areas are the campus that drew the most students that year. So in 2008, New York drew 19 students and was the first choice of most students by a long shot. If you go down and you can see in every year except for 3, Los Angeles and New York attracted by far more students than in Cincinnati. This is just a reflection of our students' preferences. What was happening from 14 to in these years right here? Well, we had very generous investment by the Jewish Community Foundation of Cincinnati. And they provided tuition, and there was a real effort to recruit students specifically to Cincinnati. And that was sustained over 6 years during particularly during the initial years of the grant. That's important to understand that even with additional resources going to recruit students to Cincinnati, additional money to supplement an already lower cost of living, I want you to see that in 14, 15, and 16, even when Cincinnati had the most students, still in those 3 years, more students chose to live in the higher cost New York and LA areas. And let's look at this a little more carefully. That in 2014, when there was significant financial incentives to encourage people to come to Cincinnati, 12 students chose it compared to a combined 17 in the coasts, which is more expensive. In 2015, when 10 students recruited with a major effort and with significant money being added to those who chose Cincinnati, still more students, 13, 7 plus 6, were choosing the higher cost New York and Los Angeles. And then in 2016, when 15 students chose Cincinnati, again recruited with major efforts, with more money to secure them, still 21 students were choosing higher costs of campuses. So why are they choosing them? Well, in large part, it's because those are the areas that our students want to be in, because of the diversity of the Jewish community, because of the expansiveness of their offerings, and because of the size and the significance of the community. When in 1950, when HUC-JIR first merged as one institution, Cincinnati was the 18th largest Jewish community in the country. It had already declined in 1950 from where it had been in 1875 when we were founded, when it was one of the largest Jewish communities in the country, akin to Philadelphia or San Francisco today. In 1950, it drops to the 18th largest. Last year, it became the 41st largest community in the United States. There's not a single pulpit cantor in the community. And so as we look at the resources that we can draw on as we focus on educational excellence, our first goal, we felt it was imperative, given the students' choices demonstrated by their preferences, by the communal resources that we have, and by the other pieces that are strengthening the work that we do, that we be in the communities that are enriching our students in that way. I do want to say that this was a hard decision upon 3 strong options, and what I'm discussing is why Cincinnati wound up being the one we thought was why New York and LA were the places we thought made sense to retain, not why Cincinnati was a bad place. Our students are getting an excellent education there, but as they decline, as our numbers are declining, we're concerned about that. One other thing, because the issue came up, this is a piece of real misinformation that I know is being spread there. I want you to see, number one, that from 14 to 21, there was a major effort made to recruit students to Cincinnati. And I started this work in April of 2019, and in both 2020 and 2021, our numbers in Cincinnati increased. They did not decrease. In fact, we were even seeing numbers in Cincinnati in 21 last year during COVID, equal to number in New York. These ebb and flow up and down, but it's simply not true to say we were trying not to encourage them. That's not the case. I know I'm going on long, but these were important issues and you grouped them. I do want to address the finances, if that's okay, Stephen.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah. So we have done a complete financial analysis, and we are aware that there are folks that feel very upset by the decision. I understand it. I appreciate it. And I appreciate that when you fund an institution, you don't want to fund it if you believe it's making bad decisions. We will lose donors and investments, and we recognize that. But the biggest single barrier to our being able to fundraise, and this has already been happening for years, is when our funders ask to see our balance sheet and when they see the cost of per students, which is about 20% higher than any of our competitors and significantly higher than even where it should be. Simply making the changes we are making will save us off the bat $750,000 per year, and by 2026 will be saving us $2 million a year in costs alone, in order to get a stronger program by concentrating our students and our resources. So that's number one. Number two, we've done a complete analysis of our lost donor funds that we're aware of. And while it's true we don't know everything, because sometimes donors are planning and they don't share it with us, again, we believe that keeping our eye on the ball for the future is a better strategic way to approach this decision than it is simply continuing when we think that what we're doing is actually detrimental to our educational outcomes.
Thank you. If we could move away from the Cincinnati campus for a minute. I don't know, is it possible, Jessica, that you can put up the slide with the comparison of the enrollments, HUC, RC, Reconstructionists, etc.?
I actually have that.
Okay.
I can do that, sure. Hold on a second. I'll put up my slide deck and right there, sure.
Okay. So one interesting thing I noticed is the 2015, 2016, 2017 with the Reconstructionists. I believe it was 2015 where the Reconstructionists, or Reconstructing, I believe it's known now, decided that they would accept students, you know where I'm going, interfaith marriage. Yes.
Absolutely.
What is the current thought, thinking process? Is anything happening with this? And I have to sort of preface, although I've already started, so it's not a preface. Men of Reform Judaism has a fairly active Twitter account. And some of the things we see on there, for those of you who don't see it, are two accounts. One is called Rogue Shul, and the other one is called Rogue HUC. Both of them, I would say, are pretty snarky, in a good sense that they also contain honest nuggets of truth, of things that probably need to be discussed. And Rogue HUC, one of the biggest topics turns out to be interfaith marriage.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you. I didn't realize Men of Reform Judaism ran Rogue HUC, so that's helpful to know that. I appreciate that. Now we'll know where to lodge our complaints for the misinformation. Yeah, a lot of I find, the Twitter and feedback like that, actually, as helpful as it is annoying, and it's bad when there's misinformation, but it is getting at the heart of people's feelings. So let me explain about the interfaith policy. In 2003-ish, it could have been 2002, could have been 2004, David Ellenson established a policy that said that students who are in interfaith relationships were not permitted in the school. And that was then revised by my predecessor, Aaron Pankin, of blessed memory, who in about 2014 or 15, soon after he began his role, said that any student in a long-term significant relationship with a non-Jew could not be admitted or receive ordination. And that meant that if you were just beginning dating or you met someone, that was okay, which was a little bit different, a little narrower than the other one. I found that objectionable in a couple of ways. Number one, it's at odds with our Reform practice. Number two, it's excluding a whole set of potential students, as you said, Stephen. It was delayed from when the Reconstructionists changed it to now they are seeing real growth in their student body. It's the one of the schools that in Hebrew College that are seeing growth. None of the other seminaries allow this. But the third issue that was most troubling to me is that I had no way of really enforcing the policy without hiring a private investigator. And I had been told by students recently graduated, as well as students here, that they're in relationships, they're just not telling anybody about it. So I don't like this idea that we have a policy that we're unwilling to enforce. I'm not willing to hire private investigators to investigate our students. And our students, for their own moral reasons, remember what I said about individual moral autonomy, are deciding that this is a policy that's unjust and therefore ignoring it. So we made one immediate change, and that was to say that we will apply this policy to students who are engaged or married, which means if you're in a long-term relationship and you're not engaged and married, I'm not going to try to vet that, and you'll have to navigate that. But we're now going through a process of asking, is that even the right restriction to have? Should we be focused at all on the identity of a student's partner versus the commitments that a student makes to being and studying and investing in Jewish leadership training? So the process that we're expecting is over the next academic year. Sometime we will be reviewing the policy. There are a lot of people that care a lot about this, and I very much respect the views on both sides. I very much respect the views that the rabbi should be held to a higher, more strict, and cantor. This is not just for rabbis, it's also for cantors. And I also understand the view that we should be only looking at the rabbi's identity, not the partner. So that's where we are, Stephen. It's in process, and we'll see where this lands based on stakeholder engagement and feedback. I'd be very curious. Does Men of Reform Judaism have a position on this?
I'm not sure that we have ever officially discussed this particular issue. I will say that we have gone as far as to say that if there is a biological female who identifies as male, that yes, she should and wants to affiliate with Men of Reform Judaism, we would be most welcome to that.
Right.
I would think if we were to poll our members, it would be a resounding and overwhelming yes. We would support that. It's a question of the Pew research and where we would go from there, which leads me into another question, and I'm deviating a little bit from what's in the Q&A, but as the moderator, I guess that's my prerogative. I'm hoping and assuming you're familiar with Men of Reform Judaism's Reform on Campus. It is a program that began, it actually grew out of another program in the mid-90s. And one of the sponsorships that we've been doing is for approximately 20 odd years or so. We have been purchasing the Jastrow dictionary, and I'm not going to go into the full name of the Jastrow. It would take up all our remaining time, but we've been buying the Jastrow dictionary for the first year in Israel students.
It's been so appreciated, and I want to thank you, and I just want to say how much I value this partnership. So thank you.
Thank you. I wish that we would be spending more on buying them rather than less. That being said, we've seen the decline in enrollment in rabbinical, cantorial, educational. I can't really speak to the School of Nonprofit Management because I don't see that much. But my question is, and this is coming, that we are men of Reform Judaism. The precipitous decline in male enrollment, the educational, I think for years has been at zero. The cantorial school, I believe in the last year, maybe one or two students, at least by name, sound male. Rabbinical, the precipitous decline. I know that part of HUC's program is to identify and recruit. What consideration is being given? And I really got to be careful with this because I'm going to get whacked with gender bias. I'm not biased. I think we need balance, we need diversity, and we need inclusion, not stratification. But there's the not so funny joke as the bar bat mitzvah child that comes home and says, "Mom, Dad, I didn't know that men could be rabbis." Where are we going with this?
Steven, thank you for that. And let me begin by some of the words that you just said. We are committed to producing sufficient numbers, enough numbers of students, leaders, of rabbis and cantors and nonprofit professionals, of leaders for the Jewish community, to meet the increasingly diversified leadership needs of our people. And that means having a diverse student body, whether they're Jews of color, whether they're students who identify as male or female or neither of those, trans or non-binary, in order to raise up, and by the way, including political and ideological diversity. So I think this is a critical question that you're asking. And I also recognize that, look, 30 or 40 years ago, we had so few women, and we did something about it. We really went out and said that wasn't okay. So I think your question is a legitimate one, and we need to be looking at it. Let me share some data with you, if I could, because I think this will illustrate the very issues that you've raised. This is our current student population. We have 287 students in our rabbinical, cantorial, and Jewish professional programs. 191 of them are female identified, 81 are male identified, and 15 are trans or non-binary. And male students are 28% of the total population. Now, we know that our total population is not 20% male, but closer to 50% male. So there's a gap there, and it's a challenge. But let's drill down just a little bit more. Here's what it looks like in each of our schools. And men make up, identified individuals who identify as male, make up a third or fewer of each group. The rabbinical school, 32% male identified. Debbie Friedman's School of Sacred Music. I want to say just right now, and I want to say for the record, I think this number is wrong because I know rabbinical students that are that identify as trans or non-binary. So we need to update these numbers. But the ratio I don't think is a mistake. The Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music, 24% male identified. I apologize for the loud noise outside of my window. Welcome to Zoom. School of Education, 20% male identified, and Zellico School, 30%. So for any other population, by the way, the numbers of Jews of color, since we're talking about diversity, is even worse than this in terms of representation. So we have a lot of work to do to diversify our population in a way that corresponds to the representative share of our communities. Because we do believe in the role modeling effects, we do believe in the diversifying effects of the value of diversity and inclusion in our school.
I just want to say for the record that we did not rehearse this. That slide was completely done without my knowledge, but
well, it's our job as a team, and I want to thank Elliot and Jessica because we talked about what should we be expected. This is men of Reform Judaism, and you might be interested how many men are you recruiting. So thank you, Steven.
Thank you. Not a question, but I just want to give you a sort of comment that was made by, I'm going to say, a very, very dear friend of mine. I don't see him anywhere near as often as I like. And I'm not going to mention his name only because it is in the chat, so it's public knowledge. It's Robert Ingram, dear friend of mine who says he doesn't have a question, but he wants to thank you because he is a Jew by conversion. I believe we now say Jew by choice, but since it's him, I'll give him his choice of words. He became a Jew by conversion 40 years ago and has never had a better explanation of who we are and what we stand for as Reformed Jews. I am proud to be a Reformed Jew. So that is something that I wanted to pass on to you so that you should know that your words have meaning. And I think we all know that our words have meaning, but in that particular case, that was something that I felt should be passed on to you. Another good friend of mine from New York, there have been dramatic changes in the Reform movement over the past 30 years. Ever since the publication of Gates of Prayer. And the question is, do you see a place or a use for the Union Prayer Book? I'm not sure whether that's really in your bailiwick, but I thought I would throw that one out to you.
Yeah, I love that question. I'll tell you why, because to me, the elenu will always be on page 617. That is, it's what I was shaped by, the Gates of Prayer. So I resonate with that prayer book, by the way, not because of the liturgy, and not because I don't value Mishkan Tefillah, which I find so much richer and so much expansive, poetic, but because it's what I'm familiar with. Gates of Prayer was what I grew up with. And I'm sure for those who grew up with the Union Prayer Book, 1 or 2, as most of you probably don't know Union Prayer Book 1 because of its history, but that probably felt more comfortable to you. What I think is most important about the direction of liturgy in the Reform movement is, number one, it is focused so much on the meaning of the words that when we pray, it's important not only what it sounds like, but that we embrace the meaning and that we're reflecting on words. And number two, that we're increasingly doing it in a language that is shared by Jews around the world and shared throughout our history, that is in Hebrew. So that pushes us, those of us who aren't native speakers, even if we know some Hebrew and we can speak some Hebrew, it nevertheless pushes us to become familiar and have a shared language. So I don't have an ideological view on which is the right one, but I'll take elenu on page 617 for the rest of my life as far as I'm concerned. That's where it belongs.
Well, okay. I think I have often said, as it relates to the Union Prayer Book, I do have my own personal prejudice in using a prayer book that was written before I was born, but that sort of gives away my age a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to go for the last questions here. And it's from another one of MRJ's valued members, and it concerns, and I want to try and paraphrase this, with the closing of Cincinnati and just the Midwest, what's going to happen with student rabbis and small, isolated congregations? And you mentioned before, and I'm not exactly certain of the context, my notes here we're fast and furious, that HUC is either underrepresented or not represented in Canada.
Right.
So if you could elaborate on that a little bit, and I think that will
Sure.
help us out a bit.
Yeah, let me clarify what I said about Canada. There was a view that where HUC is raising up rabbis, we are serving geographically. If you believe that's true, you should be very concerned that we have no presence in Canada whatsoever. Now, they say that because it's a way to say, wait a second, we know that we can serve areas where we're not present. And we know that there are sociologically 8 or 9 different regions of Jewish North America. There's Canada, and Canada has 3 regions, but in the United States, there's the Pacific Northwest. There's San Francisco, its own kind of ecosystem, Chicago, its own ecosystem. The Midwest, the South, the Deep South, the Southern Florida, Miami Beach area, the Mid-Atlantic area. I grew up in Baltimore, Philadelphia. That is not New York. I'm living in New York now. I can tell you, it's nothing like where I grew up. You have New England. So there are multiple regions that HUC doesn't serve right now. So what we're actually talking about is not a failure to serve North America. We already are serving it, but it is a shift. It's a shift of serving through our students who were so benefited from serving smaller congregations near the Cincinnati campus that often were sustaining these small congregations with their only rabbinic and religious leadership. By the way, small congregations in rural New Jersey, in rural Maine, in the rural South, they haven't been served to the extent because there are more congregations in need of rabbis, of leadership, as things are changing. So what we have to look at is, again, 15 years ago, there were 66 students on Cincinnati's campus. Next year, there will be 20 or 17 students. There's no way we can serve that number of congregations. I believe as a movement, we have an obligation to serve any congregation, no matter where they are, and we have to figure this out. So I'm working closely with Rabbi Rick Jacobs, the president of the URJ, with Rabbi Hera Person, the president of the CCAR, to come up with a strategy. And I'm pleased to say that we've raised $100,000 in initial funding to be able to support students, to be able to sustain them as we begin to slowly unwind Cincinnati. Next year, we'll have all the students who chose to go there continue to be there. We won't stop a program in Cincinnati until 2026, which gives us this time to, number one, raise up a low residency program, which is going to meet some of that need. And number two, figure out a way to begin to support these smaller congregations that have come to rely on student pulpits and service, because I do believe that we have these obligations. The number of congregations won't change that we serve, but where they serve, where we serve them, and who gets served will change.
So, to sum up, if I were a young person, and I'll take into account all genders, non-genders, going to a rabbinical cantorial educational school would be a growth opportunity. There will be jobs available.
Yeah.
Dr. Rehfeld, I want to thank you. I want to say thank you to some people who are not seen on this. Rabbi Elliot Kleinman, who is an advisor to Dr. Rehfeld, Jessica Silva, Dr. Rehfeld's chief of staff. I want to say thank you to Steve Sherman, who is our Wizard of Oz, otherwise the man behind the curtain, who is toggled back and forth between the views that you've seen. and Rob Himmelstein, who is MRJ's president. Hopefully this recording will be available on our website. It's menrj.org within the next couple of days. And if there are any questions that we haven't addressed, and I know there are many questions, if you'd like, very simply, mrj@urj.org, send me an email. Dr. Rehfeld, I will pass them on to you, and hopefully we will get all legitimate questions answered in a way that hopefully will clarify and satisfy everyone.
Stephen, thank you. And I trust that the illegitimate questions will appear on Rogue HUC. Is that right?
I would imagine that would be correct. Yes.
Listen, I just want to thank you and your membership, not only for hosting me and having the generosity of spending an hour for those of us in the East late at night, but also for the work you do every day, strengthening your communities and the movement as a whole. We're all so grateful to you, and I look forward to continuing our partnership and collaboration in the years ahead. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you for being our guest. And with that, we're going to say good night and thank you, everyone.